1340, King Edward III of England decided he should also be King of France. This triggered a war which, on and off, would last for most of the 14th century. During this 100 Years of War, as we now call it, took place some of the most famous battles of medieval times. Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. Battles where kings fought kings at the head of huge armies of knights, foot soldiers, and archers. But it was also a time for less glorious actions, when small bands of English knights roamed freely in France, looting, plundering, and killing. Because in those days, war could be a great way to make your fortune. One of these knights was a Sussex knight called Sir Edward Dallingridge. And the money he made from his adventures in France would one day help him build Bodiam Castle. But the story of Bodiam begins much, much earlier than this. Over 13 centuries earlier, when the Romans invaded Britain in AD 43. Bodiam was special because it was situated on the River Rother, which in those days was wide enough for ships to sail all the way up from the sea just 10 miles away. Even the river itself followed a different course, as Roman ships came to trade for Sussex iron. There was probably a Roman settlement here, with a harbour, and wharves where ships could tie up. The Roman road from Hastings to Rochester crossed here too. 300 years later, the Romans have left, and it's the turn of a new wave of settlers, the Anglo-Saxons. It's from these people that Bodiam may first have got its name. Boda's Harm, meaning Boda's village, named, perhaps, after an Anglo-Saxon chieftain. Centuries roll by. The Norman conquest is history. 10 English kings have come and gone, and Edward III sits on the throne. And somewhere around the year 1350, a very important woman enters the story. Her name is Elizabeth Wardidieu. She's from a wealthy family that owns considerable lands in the area, and she stands in line to inherit the manor of Bodiam, which may be one of the reasons why a certain knight named Sir Edward Dallingridge, back home for a short break from fighting in France in 1364, marries her. He's done very well for himself as one of the followers of Sir Robert Knollys, a man so notorious that French peasants were said to jump in the river at just the mention of his name. Edward is soon back off to France, where he spends a large part of the next 10 years. But in 1377, he returns home, wealthy, powerful, and influential. To cap it all, in the same year Elizabeth comes into her inheritance, making Sir Edward master of Bodiam and all its lands. There is, however, still no peace with France, and the French are getting bolder. In 1377, they crossed the Channel to burn the coastal towns of Hastings and Rye, only a few miles from Bodiam. Dallingridge is appointed by the new king, Richard II, to prepare the defences of Sussex against the French invasion that everyone believes will come. Not long after, the French raid the port of Winchelsea, and the River Rother is still wide enough for them to sail their ships as far as Bodiam itself. As if that isn't enough, there is trouble in England itself. The peasants revolt, threatening the whole basis of feudal society. No surprise then that Sir Edward decides the time has come to build a castle of his own. What with the French and the peasants, these are dangerous times. He's also a very ambitious man, And there's nothing better than a castle to remind friends, neighbors, and enemies just how big a fish you are. But not just anybody can build a castle. First, you have to have the king's permission. Fortunately, Sir Edward has friends at court, and in 1385, King Richard grants his request. In the words of the day, he is licensed to fortify and crenellate his manor house. To crenellate means to add the main feature we associate with castles, the battlements. But this is not what Edward does. Instead, he decides to build a castle from scratch further down the hill from his manor house, nearer to the river. The castle Dallingridge builds is the castle we see today, at least from the outside. It's a classic example of medieval castle building. Almost perfectly square, with round towers at each corner, square towers in between, and a massive gatehouse, all rising out of the center of a wide, deep moat. But Dallingridge wanted more than just a castle. He wanted all the appearances of a landed aristocrat. He wanted an estate. So he landscaped the whole area, creating new ponds around the castle, diverting the river, and creating a mill pond and mill next to the harbour. It must have been a pretty impressive sight. It has been debated just how serious the castle's defences really were, but any attacker would certainly have thought twice about tackling it. The moat, along with all the other water features, would have made it hard for them to get close in strength, which might have forced them to try a direct assault on the castle's main entrance, which would not have been easy, since Bodiam had all the most fashionable defensive features of its day. They'd first have to advance along the causeway, which was then parallel to the castle, under fire from the castle's defenders every step of the way. Then they'd have come up against the Barbican, a sort of mini outer castle, which would have been strongly guarded. Finally, they'd have faced the toughest challenge of all, the Great Gatehouse. This bristled with nasty surprises. First, they'd have to break through the portcullis, above which is a massive parapet with large holes, called machicolations, through which the defenders would have poured boiling tar. And even if they had managed to force their way in, they'd have been attacked again from above by stones, and more boiling tar dropped through these murder holes. Lucky for Bodiam, and for Sir Edward and Lady Dallingridge, none of this ever actually happened. The castle was never besieged in their day. Some people argue that the defences were more for show, and they may have a point, because Bodiam was also something else for Edward and his wife, a home. They had been used to the comforts of a manor house, and they weren't going to give these up just because their home was now a castle. So while it looks tough outside, it was quite the opposite inside. Imagine that these walls, now rough and ruined, were once smooth, newly quarried sandstone. Imagine that instead of empty arches, there were shuttered windows and doors made of English oak. Imagine the Great Hall, where Edward and Elizabeth, seated at the high table, would have taken their meals, together with the castle's household. Imagine servants bustling through from the kitchen, where two great fireplaces burned all day, winter and summer. Imagine the Lord's chamber, where Dallingridge would have greeted guests and carried out the business of his estate. From here, Edward and Elizabeth would have retired to the bedchamber, or attended services in the castle's chapel, looking down from their own private balcony. would have been a nice place to live, with all the creature comforts that an up-to-the-minute medieval couple would want. But hardly had his new castle been built when Dalingrige was off to France again to captain the French port of Brest. 3 or 4 years later, he died, aged about 50. Like so many knights and nobles of his day, he had spent the best part of 15 years of his life in action in France. Dalingrige was certainly Bodiam's most important owner, but the story of the castle doesn't end there. For the next 250 years, it would be on one side or the other of the various power struggles that took place in England. During the Wars of the Roses, its owners were on the Lancastrian side, which made them enemies of King Richard III. He gave orders to besiege Bodiam, but the castle very sensibly surrendered. Later, after the king himself was killed at the Battle of Bosworth, they moved back in. But it was during the English Civil War, which started in 1642, that Bodiam would meet its fate. The family who owned it were royalists, which put them on the losing side too. The castle's interior may have been plundered and destroyed by the forces of Parliament, but in any case, by the late 1600s, it had fallen into ruin. Far from being the end of the castle, this marked a strange new beginning. Though ruined inside, Bodiam was still one of the most magnificent castles to be seen anywhere. It has always been everyone's idea of the romantic medieval castle. From this point on, each of the castle's owners set out to preserve as much of Bodiam as they could. Then, a new invader entered the valley, the steam railway. It brought agricultural workers to pick beer hops, and it brought even more visitors to see Bodiam for themselves. Perhaps the most well-known owner of Bodiam was Lord Curzon, famous for restoring and preserving major monuments. He fell in love with Bodiam, and in 1917 he bought it. He began a process of conservation which continues today because on his death, he left Bodiam to the National Trust. Time and wars move on. While Bodiam might have put up a good defense in medieval times, it would have been useless against the planes, tanks, and artillery of 20th century warfare. Which is why, during the last World War, a new kind of defense was built here. The pillbox. Bodiam's pillbox was part of a chain of strategic defenses built to guard vulnerable parts of the country against invasion. This time, by Germany. Once again, the invasion never came. Bodiam is now besieged every day by hundreds of visitors drawn to Edward Dalingrige's inspired vision of the perfect home for a medieval knight.